Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will discuss the various interconnecting components of modernization of the football grounds and stadiums created and used by the University of Iowa and Iowa State University to better understand their unique stories within national trends. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Kennedy Reichart is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not be able to get to all of the questions. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Chad Seifried. He is the L.M. Pat and Mildred Harrison Professor in Sports Management at the Louisiana State University. His research interests embrace the use of historical methods to review the management history associated with organizations, individuals, and sports facilities to highlight the contribution of history within contemporary management settings. Specifically, his work involving facilities primarily reviews innovation and modernization to better understand the construction and preservation history of professional and intercollegiate sport venues as commercial attractions. Collectively, his work has been published in many notable sports management, marketing, education, law, history, and management journals. His research success garnered him Research Fellow Awards with the North American Society for Sports Management and College Sport Research Institute. Chad has also been recognized for his outstanding efforts in various journals and professional associations and in areas such as management history, management education, and organizational theory. He serves on numerous educational boards and currently serves as Educator Emeritus for the Journal of Issues in Intercollegiate Athletes and Associate Editor for the Journal of Management History. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Chad to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction there. And I also want to thank the State Historical Society of Iowa for granting me this opportunity to speak with you all today about my research project here on the modernization of major college football stadia in the state of Iowa, comparing Iowa State University and the University of Iowa. I'd also like to thank the State Historical Society for a research grant they provided me to help complete a lot of the work that I'm going to share with you all today, but also work that I intend to do or complete as I proceed forward with this research in the future. So let me go ahead and begin here my presentation by talking about the purpose and exactly what I intended to do here with the research project here. And that is mostly to examine like the modernization of football fields and stadia since 1890. That's when institutions of higher education in the state of Iowa really first started playing intercollegiate football. I'm really interested in also in understanding like kind of the motivation behind various changes, and mostly from a management perspective, because that's the kind of field I'm in. I'm also looking to understand the history to help me make predictions on future innovation and maybe new construction activity that not only both Iowa and Iowa State might be part of in the future, but also maybe what might happen nationally or regionally. Certainly, if you think about the Big 12, the Big 10 conferences that both Iowa and Iowa State are in. You're going to hear me talk a little bit more about this later on, but I'm also interested in taking a look at, as part of my historical analysis, what are the perspectives of various stakeholders. So you might think of students, alumni, but you also might think of local people, business people in the area, state legislators, anyone who might have some kind of important connection with those institutions. I might also be interested in taking a look at what innovations took place over time. If you think about like advancements in scoreboards, you go from manual scoreboards to electric scoreboards to video scoreboards, and now high definition digital video boards. Those are innovations that took place. So definitely looking at the impact of innovations on facilities and institutions over time, and then also what kind of other events might be connected to the evolution of these facilities with respect to the construction, renovation, but also how they're financed over time. And one of the key components I want everybody to kind of think of or take heart in is that the maturation of sport as a business activity is very much reflected in the changes that you're going to see me talk about as a venue, as their venues change over time. So again, as sport matures as a business, so does the venues that the competition venues that the teams play in. For those of you that may not be familiar with modernization, as a conceptual or theoretical lens to potentially examine works like I'm doing here today, it's mostly just a research construct used to try to help explain that kind of evolution or changes in societies. Again, for someone who's in management, more like myself, we're really interested in trying to utilize modernization as a way to help us predict future shapes, patterns, and also constructions, practices that organizations might be part of moving forward. And I'd like to point out before I proceed, with kind of explaining more about what is modernization. There is a significantly strong influence by sport historians, but also economics historians in the development of that concept, not just historically, but also even into the present, which I'll talk more about later. Some of the things you might see related to how people might explain these kind of evolution of changes in societies. Well, they'll talk a lot about technology. So you'll see a lot of modernization pieces feature information about changes and advances in technology over time. The development of job specialization, but also in conjunction with that, you also have the emergence of new occupations that happen within various institutional fields and organizations. Standardization, in this instance, maybe for sport, you might think of rules, but you can also apply the idea of standardization to a lot of other areas of life. Rationality, the idea that we're trying to increase and improve safety and security, but that's kind of an evolving term over time. So we'll talk a little bit about that as part of the featured conversation here. Reducing and improving, reducing dysfunction, but improving efficiency, the rise of philanthropy, the improvement of the environment, something much more recent than we've seen in the past, much more emphasis on interest in trying to improve the environment moving forward, but also enhancing the comfort. And again, a lot of these things, hopefully you'll see, are very much connected to evolving kind of consumer preferences and capitalism with respect to desirable products and services. There's a lot of personal utility in modernization for myself. I just kind of want to promote the idea that I've done a lot of different things on US, like ballparks, stadiums, and arenas. I've also done a lot of things at the intercollegiate level, not just at the professional level as well. And I do also have some future plans to start utilizing modernization to help me do some studies on automobile racetracks, primarily like NASCAR, IndyCar, Formula One, and that would be both in the US and international. So I found quite success in this personally from a research perspective, the use of modernization. So from a typology perspective, there are different popular kind of types that have been presented on how we might further refine or frame modernization. One is reflexive modernization, which is this idea of this rise of individualism against kind of conventional structures. And it's really focusing on kind of concerns or protecting against the rise of risk. So you see a lot of organizations or industries or institutional fields reorganize or reform over time as a result of kind of their efforts to modernize. You also see this idea of monitoring risk emerge often and how that might change over time within this reflexive modernization. The idea of reducing risk is very kind of sometimes elusive because what is modern very much within a public or institutional field changes. This idea of balancing risk and the pursuit of safety and security against the status quo. Sometimes you have this kind of dual crisis occurring. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those kind of things or present how those things might be seen in some of the research I have here today. And then we're also going to talk about how we identify risks in society, but created by society and the idea that risk can grow as complexity grows. So A second type of modernization, very popular, that you'll see used that are identified in the literature, has this idea of like ecological modernization. This is something that emerged a little bit more towards like the 1980s, reflexives, which I just talked about, more towards like the mid like 20th centuries when you start seeing people identify this term of reflexive modernization. But like I said, ecological, much more oriented towards the 1980s. This idea that we can potentially, from a capitalist perspective, seek to control the environment, improve the environment. And so we have a lot of ideas and interest in trying to think about how we might overcome, things that the environment presents us, but also how we might utilize and incorporate the environment to help us like advance forward, move as a society. A lot of this discussion, ecological modernization, focuses a lot on like kind of the political climate. So certainly that'd be something I'd be interested in, this kind of study, talking about the modernization of football stadium. Like, what's the political climate like? What's the policies there? As far as like how they foresee modernization happening, and the idea of like environmental pressures versus like government mandates versus like moral obligations that institutions might feel or they might have to modernize. And I have it on here just that kind of LEED certification. So this is like leadership in energy and environmental design. This is something that you'll see many like professional sport organizations try to pursue because they can get tax benefits out of it. They can increase the value of the building and the franchise who might own the building. But they also are doing it because it's the right things to do. But they also might need to do it in order to pursue like some kind of like joint like PPP, private-public partnership mix as far as like how buildings might be financed moving forward. So again, sometimes just from an ecological perspective, we can see political interest trying to impacting like what we're doing. And then a third type of modernization, which has not really been presented formally, but it's something I'm currently working on to try to create like a new typology, will be this idea of like financial modernization. This is a term that has been used, but not really conceptually organized. So one of my real goals with this work here, but also this work that I'm doing to help contribute to other work, is really set forward on trying to establish financial modernization as like kind of a third typology to both complement but also differentiate some other things that might be happening from a modernization perspective. Again, complement both reflexive and also ecological. So, Krosner and Siller are people that talk a lot about like what makes a financially modern society or what is financial modernity. And so you'll see them talk about items of like public interest versus private interest, the idea of like ideology, like how voters and lawmakers might influence like the financial structures over time, and then how the government. So one of the terms they have is called like Leviathan, and how the government expansion and how they might increase spending. So a great example of that would be like the WPA, the New Deal programs that helped support a lot of different like projects during the 1930s during the Depression. That introduced a new type of federal financing of, stadiums in this instance, or arenas and sport facilities, but a whole host of other buildings that we know are still being used today. Scylla talked about the other things that you might recognize as part of stable financial systems, having to do with like how we manage public debt, how do we set up debt, how do we manage like monetary systems and banking systems, and who are institutional lenders and such, and the debt equity, and then also money market instruments, and even insurance. So there's a lot of different kind of markers of like financial modernization. But I wanted to follow that up with you just real briefly on the kind of financial markers of facility modernization, things that you might see. And this is kind of not an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea by, at certain times in history, you see, the introduction of new types of financing in sport facilities, and then those get added on to previous ones that were already used. So early on, you hear me talk a little bit about student labor and student fees and such like that. It's kind of the way we like would pay for stuff. But then later on, bonds get invented, whether they're obligation bonds, but then later revenue bonds, and then state appropriations, and the idea that we have philanthropy. So we have that being pursued through like the development of like athletic foundations and stuff like that. So this is all something that is building on something else that was already previously set. So this is just some examples of markers of sport facility financial modernization. And these are things that I'll be interested in tracking as part of the presentation I'm going to give you today. And then this is just kind of a summary slide, just gives you an idea about, like, again, some of the characteristics of each of those different types of modernization, some of the shared characteristics that they have, but then also some distinguished items that I might want to highlight specifically with financial modernizations. I'm, again, trying to help develop the theory on modernization through presenting like financial modernizations, kind of like a new typology, if you will. So how did I pull off the project, or how am I working on the project that I'm currently presenting you today? So step one, as far as like my method goes, I actually went through an archival visit with both the special collections and libraries at Iowa and Iowa State University. And I actually just did that this past week. So this is very much like an active project for me, and something I can intend to complete over the next few months. Documents that I collected on both those kind of trips, but also even prior to visiting, include a variety of items that you might see specific to those organizations, newspapers, organizational reports, letters of correspondence, or memorandums, things you might see in different like collections, like from presidential papers or the athletic departments and stuff like that. Other featured documents you might see might be like financial statements and tax forms and game programs. There's a lot of ways you can garner information about the modernization of sport facilities through looking at these different documents here. From a secondary perspective, there are scholarly books that have been developed on both institutions, not specifically just on football, but also obviously the institutional histories, which may provide some pretty valuable information for me as I move forward in developing this work. Journal articles, newspaper articles, national media publication, anything I can get from a whole host of databases. So I just thought it'd be interesting just to type in some of the names of the databases I've used here to help me put together some things for today, help me prepare for the archival trips that I did complete already, but also things that I intend to use as I move forward writing up the document. This is the next couple of slides, just gives you an idea of some sample documents I got actually from the archives this past week at Iowa and Iowa State. So this one right here is some things in Iowa. You can see some things specific to Kennewick Stadium and Iowa State, or Iowa Field off to the left. So this is like Iowa history. If you go to Iowa State, again, I can feature some things on Track Trice Stadium, which is where they currently play at, but also Clyde Williams Stadium, where they previously played at. So different things from different paper collections, different athletic departments and stuff like that. Whole host of variety. Certainly this is just a sample. I have a much larger document collection that I got from both institutions this past week. I thought I'd actually share some photographs with you of some of the things like I did collect as part of the samples. So you can see off to the left with Iowa, this is an architectural plan that we have from Iowa Field back from like 1920, in the 1920s. In the middle, this is an article from the Iowa alumnus. It's actually written by one of the board of control people. You can see Byron Lambert, and who's the chairperson of the board during that time. And then the third document I have here is just, again, a sample of primary sources. Is an actual contract. This was on a renovation project they were doing at Iowa Stadium, what you see on the left here, back in like 1922. So it's just about adding like grandstands to that particular facility. Other things you might see from like Iowa State, for example, this is a game program I kind of mentioned early. You'd be certainly surprised what kind of information you can get from someone asking questions like I'm asking about a sport facility, what might be in a game plan. For example, you might have concessions maps or like maps of restrooms or locations that help you count out those kind of things. The middle document in here is from H. Summerfield Day, who was actually like the university architect at Iowa State. So this is a document he put together based on like his work and job responsibility there. Certainly something that's important is primarily coming from the host institution. And then the far right document is just basically a financing plan to help like Iowa State help its potential donors understand like how their donation might lead to the building of like the new stadium. In that instance, it would eventually be Jack Trice Stadium. These are some of the secondary sources kind of collected. So you can see some different books here at Iowa, and then you can see a newspaper off to the right. Just moving forward, again, a couple of books on Iowa State, but then we have like differently a little bit from the State Historical Society, like an actual journal issue here. You can see of the predecessor. It looks like the Iowa Annals of Iowa there. So what's the second part after I collect all that information is kind of do like a source criticism, if you will. So again, just kind of question the trustworthiness of the people putting together. What's the authority of the people writing the document? What's their perspective? Do they have any bias? Do they look like they have requisite skill to collect and like analyze information? What's their reputation in the field to generate conclusions? Other things you might ask during this kind of historical court, source criticisms, like looking at the origin or the source of the document. A lot of times I'm trying to pursue, when I write out things that are closer to the date of the events. So if I'm going to write about something in the 1920s, I want to get stuff from the 1920s to see what it looked like during that time. So the place of production of the document, where's it coming from? I mean, things closer to the source are going to be a little bit more credible for me from that perspective. Identifying the purpose of the audience of the document. Again, who was this developed for? Again, a newspaper talking about something that happened in the 1920s. In today's environment, it's going to maybe talk about it something a little bit differently than maybe people at this particular time here. And then what kind of environmental conditions were in place from when the record or artifact was created. So those are different kind of questions I'm doing as I'm looking at each of these documents and sources as I move forward with the research. Step 3 in my process on how I kind of put together this study, but also future studies and projects related to this topic is analyze and interpret the evidence. So I spend quite a bit of time talking about like developing outlines and timelines and trying to triangulate all the information to see what pieces corroborate one another, but which pieces kind of like help explain stories in a little bit better ways when I think pieces might be missing. So any kind of inferences, conclusions, connections that can be made, I try to go ahead and do that. And then throughout when I'm doing that, obviously since I'm using modernization as kind of a theoretical lens, I'm also kind of implicitly coding my information from the documents using modernization. So I might again, from a facility perspective, look to detail information on this, utilizing the outline and timelines and triangulation. But also I'm going to appreciate the idea of like contextual items that might be impacting items. So again, if you look at the 1930s, for example, you might say, well, hey, there's not a whole lot of construction activity going on during that time. And I might say, well, that's because the Depression's going on. So you need to know that, maybe there's not as much money flowing around, or maybe there's just not as much construction material being made to help schools renovate facilities like these, 2 schools were doing at different times over their history. So as a results section goes, it kind of transition into that. What I plan on doing is sharing with you is just a few photos and just trying to fill in like what I kind of discovered to date so far and some things that I think will be on the horizon moving forward. So in the 1890s, when we start seeing Iowa and Iowa State both start up football, we're going to see like very simple, small, temporary kind of built grounds. They may have not started with actual bleachers, but then typically what happens is students will start building bleachers as more and more people become interested in watching contests. There's also this need to try to build bleachers in an effort to kind of help control the crowds a little bit, to help them or to prevent them from interfering with the games on the field. I will point out too, is if you can see here in the background a little bit, we got these like tarps in the background. It kind of blocks people's views of just getting free looks at the field. You have some gentlemen here standing up on top of a wagon here to try to catch a free view of the field if they can. You'll see a subsequent kind of thing like that coming up here in the next picture. But I will mention that there are a lot of things in the modern stadiums that we see today that aren't present in this particular picture. You don't see press boxes. We don't see, scoreboards. There's not restrooms and concession stands and stuff like that. These are very simple types of built facilities, simply to host the teams that are playing and to generate some money via the gate receipts that are collected eventually by the crowds that are kind of, coming into the game. This is a picture from Iowa State during the same time period. Again, the same kind of tarp field. I'll point out to you if you're looking around here, trying to block out people's views, but we still have some people. Looks like they're on top of a train car here to try to catch a free view of the field, if you will. Some people standing on some mounds here of dirt that have been developed outside of the facility. You're going to see a lot more maximization of seats where most of the action takes place. So in football, most of the action takes place between the 20-yard lines. And so you're going to see a lot more seating there than you would say in the end zones here, what you have here. But again, very simple types of wood based of facilities, reflective of an immature sport at this particular time. But we know sport matures as a business. So as a result of that, we start seeing advancements such as going from a wood facility to something that may be a little bit more concrete or a little bit more permanent. So in this instance, we're looking at Iowa Field, which was one of the earlier, permanent fields that the University of Iowa built during its time. It's contemporary at the time at Iowa State is going to be State Field. You start to see those schools like use state appropriations, athletic associations that are developed to help finance construction of these venues. There's also like gate receipts used presently, but also the promise of future gate receipts with financial lenders that might help them supply the money to help build these particular types of buildings. When we start getting to this phase, we start seeing a lot less use of like student labor to help us build the facilities, and a lot more interest in trying to use like more professionalized services, professionalized organizations, contractors, and such like that. People that have experience in building these types of buildings here. So you are going to see scoreboards in these facilities, though. Don't presently see too many of these kind of things in this particular venue here. But you start seeing like really rough, like small, like press boxes set up in display for the press as the press takes more interest in sport. Moving forward and such. This is a picture of like again State Field, and then eventually Clyde Williams Field as it turns into, again, maximizing the seats where most of the seating takes place. Again, we aren't going to see like the presence of like restrooms and electronic scoreboards and stuff like that. We don't really start seeing that kind of stuff until we get into the 1920s. So these kind of facilities are still absent of those kind of things. They may have locker rooms or team rooms for the teams to change into, but there's really not concession stands and things like that at these particular places, things that we would associate with the modern stadiums. We start to see in these particular venues like bleachers, though, get built on, sometimes added on after the permanent additions might be initially established. We will see ticket booths established for the first time, and much more permanent fencing set up to help with the crowd control. And then the last thing I'll say beyond the idea that these are enclosures is that you also see these things as multi-sport kind of complexes. So you can see like the running track here, and certainly there was a running track on the previous facility, and not only that, but a baseball field behind it. If we took a look at Iowa's structure again. So again, still simple facilities, still not huge capacity crowds, but something that shows that sports maturing as a business, and we're starting to see, the development of press boxes and scoreboards and other kind of things. As you can see, there's a scoreboard, there's press boxes, helping to advance those facilities over time. As you get into the 1920s, this is when the temporary venues nationally start to go away, and we start seeing the rise of much more sizable, like permanent reinforced steel and concrete types of venues. Iowa Field disappears and gets replaced ultimately by what is now Kinnick Stadium. So off to the left, you'll see, it's kind of earliest version of Kinnick Stadium. You can see a much more smaller scoreboard. In the middle, we can see a much more developed, larger press box than we'd have seen previously, at the other fields. But clearly, like, that facility is not going to stand still. As enrollments increase in size, as alumni subsequently increase in size over time, as media takes a better interest in the sport, as we start to see more requests for like type of premium seating experiences and such, you're going to see the rise of larger like press boxes, larger capacities, but then also the development of restrooms and concession stands permanently placed into the building. We start to see a lot more concern about parking as well. Again, prior to the 1920s, we don't have as many people attending games via cars. In some instances, cars that hadn't even existed yet. But now we're starting to see the development of cars, and so subsequently parking becomes a big issue on how we get people to facilities. We also see the rise of different like communication technology. So by the time we get to the Towards the end of the 1920s, but substantially more in the 1930s and beyond, radio becomes much more prominent, activity that's being broadcast out of the facilities, also used as a source of revenue for the sports teams or the athletic departments at this time. We also see television rise once we get into the 1950s and 60s, again, as a new type of communication tool. And we start to see that actively take shape in space and occupy space in these new developing like kind of press box areas and stuff like that. And one of the reasons I also picked out this picture here is because this is a picture of like Kinnick Stadium with artificial turf. And so this is a new type of innovation in addition to those communication innovations I just mentioned that helps create is developed to help with the idea of risk. So you see a lot of people talk about at this particular time the decrease of risk with the artificial turf. From a finance perspective, people talk about the idea of adopting turf in the venue because it helps save money on maintenance costs and stuff like that. So we'll talk about some other things coming up in some of the conclusions, but certainly we have the development of new types of things here. This is a transition from Clark Field, Williams Field, or Clyde Williams Field to ultimately what would be Jack Trice Stadium off to the right. So left to right, you go from that, to the other. Again, this simpler facility grows over time, and it essentially ends up outgrowing the campus spot that it's in due to other buildings, campus buildings, and stuff like that. So what do? They relocate the facility to a new area on the perimeter of campus. And as you can see, Trice Stadium off to the right is much more part of a larger kind of entertainment complex that's developed between Hilton Coliseum and also the large state auditorium that's in there. The large parking space, again, a feature of this. But also want to talk about like the design aspect of this particular building, which was in the 70s. This is very reflectively called modernist architecture, and this multi-cantilever design that you would see characteristics of that era. The idea that the second deck is like sits up further away from the field, and that's to help avoid like obstructive viewpoints in the stadium that would have plagued like predecessor facilities that would have had upper decks sitting on top of lower decks and would have had obstructive beams like obstructing views from people sitting in the lower section. But you can see again much more sophisticated developed building here as far as like technology goes. Continuing with Iowa State, you'll see a little bit more advancement of this, a little bit more permanent seating now in the end zones. You can start seeing that we even have overflow crowds that are starting to occupy space outside the end zone stands, suggesting that maybe a future renovation at this point in time could include the enclosing of the end zones, which for those of you that are familiar with Jack Trice Stadium today, we do know that these things have been enclosed substantially since then. But I think one of the things that's really important to point out in here is just some subtle differences on here besides the astroturf and grass is the size of the scoreboard. Very small over here, very big over here. And so you can start to see a little bit more development of these sections and such like there. Iowa State or University of Iowa, Kinnick Stadium, again, we see some advancement in size and development of it. You go from here off to the left, much smaller press box. Now we got a press box that covers the whole width of the sideline, and something that hosts like premium seating, such as luxury suites and club seat sections, to allow for a different class of a fan to be developed, so to speak. And then you can see that obviously the enclosure here of the end zone here is much more substantial and is a much larger scoreboard. And these kind of things are all including like additional like resources for concessions and restrooms and such like that as well, as part of the modernization of those facilities there. And this is kind of giving you an idea where I was talking about earlier with the enclosure of Iowa State, the idea that more is added to those facilities over time and they become a much more high-tech building. I think you could probably anticipate moving forward that this thing's going to get a lot bigger. At least that's what I would expect, from Iowa State moving forward as far as like, luxury suites and club seat sections and such like that goes. So from a discussion and conclusion section, excuse me, some of the preliminary finds I have so far is that you see a lot of like different stakeholder groups emerge to help influence the modernization, the growth, expansion, the maturation of these facilities over time, to match the maturation of sport as a business entity. These stakeholders include students, administrators, alumni, but also civic and business leaders in the area. Even state legislators also as well in the state of Iowa is something I've started to identify, are all part of these discussions, and they ultimately lead to these new constructions and then ultimately the renovation efforts of, Jack Trice Stadium, but also Kinnick Stadium. We see these the stadiums emerge in stages. So again, the simple to much more complex. They go from small to very big over time. And again, they're developed to help address a lot of different kind of stakeholder preferences. So the stakeholders of the student athletes and coaches are addressed in renovations. Certainly amenities like restrooms and concession stands and video boards and stuff like that are there for the, in-stadium attendees. And then you got media, the press boxes expand substantially over time in capability. And so these kind of things are all done to help address like needs that they might have, whether it's radio, the written press, newspaper press, but also the television, groups as well. Even with more modern changes to, webcasting and streaming and Wi-Fi systems, these kind of things have also been part of the additions of modernization of those facilities over time. These services that have been part of these, facilities are also important to note. The idea that these buildings are capable of doing more, and being able to function in a variety of ways that their predecessors couldn't imagine, and serving the public in. And then the construction and modernization of the facilities, again, are very much like reflective, like consumer-driven, preferences. So those are things that I definitely want to emphasize. Early on, we had, again, to kind of sum up some of the things that, I've found so far to date, is we have a lot of students are early funding the facility. Sometimes they're physically put in the manual labor to build the stands and stuff like that. But again, as I mentioned earlier, they're being replaced by much more specialized professionals later on. We have increased financial opportunities that the universities start to see, and so then that becomes like a calling card for them. Both universities start saying they need to have more control over athletics, and in particular football and the facilities, in order to better regulate the activities that are happening within. And so fences, grandstands pop up, but then later on we see, advertisements via scoreboards. We see, new technology in the press boxes, all part of this idea of trying to increase the financial viability and revenue that might be produced from those buildings. Environmental factors are also impacting the facilities. Again, the government starts to rise up to help support the facilities. Sometimes the states themselves, or the Iowan in particular, in this particular case, recognize the sport facilities as kind of a social anchor, as our calling card to justify the significance of the state. So the idea is that we need to have a good sport facility in order to advertise that we're a legitimate institution of higher education, or that we're a legitimate state. That's something I definitely started seeing in some of the documents I've been reading prior to giving this presentation today. Fan preferences, is particularly with premium seating, or things that have emerged. Sound system, the quality of video boards and other kinds of amenities are also important to acknowledge in this modernization story. Community interest, again, alumni associations, foundation offices emerge, and they emerge specifically in some ways, and later on specifically emerge to just help support athletics and facility construction, that are moving forward. And that's very reflective of what's going on in, national trends that really start in the 1970s and move forward from there. And then we start seeing, again, the idea that, businesses recognize the sport facilities as a place they could advertise, partnerships they could create with the institution. They sell off naming rights, or we develop naming rights in order to sell off different pieces or parts of the buildings and stuff like that. So you might see Jack Trice Stadium with a specific field name to it today, out of respect for those kind of conclusions there. Last couple things in here before I get to some real quick, like kind of future aspects of where I think we're headed. I think in the future we might be thinking about we're going to be paying much more attention to student athlete safety, as far as like the technology goes, locker room upgrades, training rooms, strength conditioning. These are things they've done over time. I think we're going to continue to see those kind of things, moving forward. I think universities are also very much interested in like saving costs, They want to minimize deferred maintenance. So I think we might see a lot more kind of things incorporated in the venues moving forward that might help us understand how to maybe better use the environment and stuff like that, moving forward. And then I think also we're going to see a lot of, from a contextual perspective, a lot of influence from like conference peers. So in the case of Iowa, what's the Big Ten schools doing? But also in the Big 12, that's what's questions like Iowa State's going to be asking. Interestingly, I haven't seen so much like of the one university talking about what the other university has and vice versa. I've seen a lot more concentration on the correspondence and documents and the memorandums and such like that. More of them talking about like what other conference peers are doing rather than like what the other school in the state's doing, at this time presently. Other propositions, I want to, kind of make here to kind of sum up my presentation today. One is we got institutions are, looking to downsize the potential seating to increase the amount of premium seating, moving forward. This has been a national trend. You've seen a lot of like Pac-12 schools do this in recent years where they've decreased capacity to increase the size and capacity of their concourses, the amenities they have inside, but also increase the number of like premium seating. So we sacrifice 2 seats of regular seats to create 1 premium seat. We're seeing a lot more of that kind of stuff happening. Other schools in the country, Penn State more recently, Tennessee's also talked a lot about renovating their facilities, and I think they're going to actually decrease capacity in an effort to try to increase concourse space and premium seating opportunities there. And this is in an effort to try to generate more revenue out of those buildings. Proposition number 2 is to think about how we can build retail and entertainment zones in these facilities. Is it possible that we can make these kind of things more of a, not just a destination for like, 7 or 8 weeks a year, but as a place that people could come to a lot more regularly. So I think we're going to start seeing that set up in a lot more prominent fashion moving forward, not just at Iowa, but also kind of nationally. I think moving forward is kind of some of the things I've seen as trends. I think the institutions are going to make potential, they're going to try to reduce their impact on like resources they might take from the environment. And so they might facilitate corporate partnerships or partnerships with government or nonprofit or organizations to try to figure out how they might facilitate like future, facility construction. So I think we might see a lot more kind of use of like renewable sources of energy, or certainly like environmentally friendly program and services in buildings to try to help them not just to improve the environment, but maybe teach other people how to improve the environment as well. Number 4, I think grant funding, government agencies are also going to be kind of a source for project renovations and stuff like that. And then with the age of these particular buildings and the idea that they might host a lot of heritage and nostalgia for people, I think we might be looking at potentially the notion of like heritage and preservation grants and stuff like that to help like renovate different aspects of the facility. If we can't develop partnerships that might help us, fund those particular things, or large philanthropic donations that might come to the institutions. And then just the last 2 propositions that I have here is this idea that some institutions are going to incorporate like on-site sport betting areas. I think that might be something that might even be popping up at institutions up there. I know at my own school at LSU, we actually do have on-site gambling things in our own Tiger Stadium here. So that might be something that I think the state of Iowa might be looking at, potentially moving forward, or certainly other states are doing the same kind of thing moving forward. And then expanding the financing portfolio is something I think we're going to continue to see. I mean, early on when we had these initial new constructions or we had these early renovations, we only saw like 1 or 2 different kind of things like financing those particular projects. But now you're going to have like a cocktail of different types of like financing approaches in order to pull off these really complicated types of renovations and new construction activities. So that's where I want to conclude my presentation. I knew I only had about 40 minutes or so to talk here. So this is the end of my presentation on the modernization of Iowa and Iowa State football stadiums. So I'm happy to take any kind of questions at this point.
Thank you, Chad. We do have some time to answer some questions. So if you do have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions today. So Chad, our first question that we have for you, is Iowa unique in the sense that 2 major college football stadiums are named in honor of fallen students?
Yeah, actually, that's a very interesting question, and I haven't noticed a whole lot of other college stadiums at this point. And I've done quite a bit of work on college football stadiums throughout the country, and so definitely Iowa is one of those unique stadiums because predominantly, if you take a look at the names of stadiums throughout the country, you're going to see a lot of like memorial stadiums, and so those are recognizing typically World War One, or in some cases much less so, but still nonetheless war memorials, World War II types of stadiums. So yeah, the idea that Iowa has 2 stadiums in its state and 2 major college football playing stadiums named after students for different types of reasons, but certainly important reasons nonetheless, as far as like honoring those people and their legacy. I think that's certainly something that makes Iowa unique amongst its peers.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, you've mentioned that you visited the archives at both Iowa State and the University of Iowa and done digital research. What other resources or people would help you better your research on Iowa stadiums?
So can you repeat the back part of that a little bit? My ears were popping.
No, you're good. So I'll just repeat the question. So you visited the archives at both Iowa State and the University of Iowa and done digital research. What other resources or people would help you better research Iowa stadiums?
So one of the things I certainly would I would advise people to do if they're interested in stuff like this, or certainly things I plan on doing moving forward, is reaching out to the actual athletic departments. That's not something I've done yet. So from a people perspective, I think they potentially would be a good reservoir of information. I'll give you a great quick example. When I was doing a similar project on the state of Mississippi with Ole Miss, they actually had like a historian that was part of their athletic department. And so I reached out to that individual and they provided me a whole bunch of stuff, and that was very useful to help me manage that, moving forward. As far as like other kinds of resources go, I mean, certainly, if anybody here has things that they'd like to share with me, I'm happy to have conversations and take that great advice you might have. But I have, different databases I make use of too. There's a variety of databases that I have that might help me procure documents and such that, will help me move on. But, some of the things that I couldn't get on campus, for example, I think I can follow up later on with specific people that might be, archivists in those particular those libraries there on campus. But yeah, speaking to the actual athletic department, I think that might be a place to move forward.
I'd say, is there any other for further research that you're looking for in people other than just the athletic offices?
Well, I mean, if there are like anyone that specializes in sports studies, so I know like the University of Iowa has a American Studies department that has a specialty area in sports studies. So there could be faculty on those campuses that I think would be really attractive to potentially reach out to help maybe even co-author like this works that I'm working on right now, if we come to that. So yeah, certainly there might be faculty on those campuses, whether they're in their history department, okay, or some other unit on campus that might be useful.
Awesome, thank you. So you've been published in many management or athletic journals. What's your experience with publishing your work with state historical societies?
Oh, I'm glad you actually asked me that question there. So this is just another slide I had. I thought I'd share with everybody. So I didn't really realize when I started doing this, because this was something I initially started off of another project I was working on with one of my doc students. But as we were collecting data on different like archival trips we started doing, I just started thinking like, man, this would be a really interesting story. I wonder if like, State Historical Society might be really interested in paper on something like this. So, this is just a sample of some of the papers I've had published, but I've had, papers published in South Carolina and Mississippi and Tennessee and Georgia, Southwest Historical, Quarterly, and all kinds of different, locales as far as like specific, like, modernization or some kind of like historical analysis of just the sports stadium and the evolution of those on particular university campuses. And sometimes I use different theoretical lenses where I'm looking at like institutional theory. Sometimes I've used the other things, like, so you can see like legitimacy would be more of like institutional theory, as far as like the thing I did on like University of Southern Miss, but also use like innovation diffusion as other types of theoretical lenses. I often try to do something like that in the particular types of papers I write, just because that's more of the home base or more of a natural type of writing style for me. But I'm actually really excited about putting together a project or work for Iowa, seeing how this might play out. And then some of these articles have really been starting to catch some attention as far as like citation counts go. So I think going forward, I don't have any plans to slow down. I'm going to try to visit as many campuses as I can. So I certainly appreciate the State Historical Society of Iowa there provide me a generous grant to go do some research there.
Awesome, thank you.
And I should add, I'd be happy to like send any of these papers to anybody if you're interested in any of them.
Awesome, thank you. We had a question about, do you see any trends in Stadia construction to kind of for multi-purpose them for use by other sporting events?
So there is some instance where we're starting to see the reconfiguration of current facilities, but also the development of new facilities with the idea they could serve more functions than just for football. Colorado State built a new stadium a couple years ago, and they can do like lacrosse and some other types of sports on there, on that particular facility. We don't see a whole lot of extra like redevelopment of facilities or redevelopment of new facilities like that, though, that's going to serve multiple sports. We actually see more development of like extensions onto that building to help service other sports, but also other academic activities as well. So like as a new addition might pop onto a facility, maybe it supports a couple more seats, maybe some luxury suites. Inherently, we're starting to see where that section of the stadium is now maybe the new host of the Student Athlete Academic Center, or maybe it's now a new classroom building set for the rest of the campus to use. We've seen new cafeteria and like commons areas, space like that used in there, because on one day of the week that kitchen area is used for the facility, but then the other days of the week it's used for students on campus, but also student athletes, maybe their training tables and stuff like that. So we've seen the increased functionality of the buildings, through those different, types of capacities. We've also created opportunities, or we've seen opportunities for facilities be used for other types of purposes, maybe something that they weren't originally designed for, such as like the use of concerts. And so we start to see like the emergence of concerts. So like our own stadium here, Tiger Stadium, we've had these Bayou Country Fest where they have these, big country acts come in, whether it's, even pop acts too, including like Taylor Swift, have come in and like play concerts in those facilities. So we're starting to see more use of the facilities from that perspective, but we're not seeing a whole lot more use of the venues for other sports unless they build some like kind of larger like athletic training or straight conditioning room, which they give access to other sports.
Awesome, thank you. So our next question kind of talks about the community around these college football stadiums. So you mentioned that community connections to college football stadiums, especially in Iowa where we don't have a pro sports team. How is this impacted if the team itself has either a bad season or multiple bad seasons in a row?
Well, I have actually quite a bit of attendance data. And again, it's paid attendance, so not actual turnstile attendance for both Iowa and Iowa State. So even when like those two schools had maybe like substantial like lulls or like lower performing teams for consecutive years, they've had very, very strong like fan bases as far as like fans in attendance or fans purchasing tickets, at those venues. It's something actually I've seen in some of the write-ups of the articles saying justifying like a lot of other places have had like a lot more pressure to have like good performing teams before people would commit money to help them build additions, but that hasn't historically, from what I've read so far, been the case in Iowa. There's been a lot more, even when the teams haven't been very good, there's been a lot more like support. So I think that certainly leads, some credibility to the potential claims that, states maybe without professional teams might have a lot more kind of like stronger fan loyalty than you might see in states where you have a lot more like number of like pro teams there. And that's just because like, if the pro teams are a lot further away, then, than the home college team's more like the pro team, if you will.
Awesome. Thank you. So our last question that we will have for you today, Chad, is how did you become interested originally in this topic?
So I have always been interested in the development of stadiums. My own dissertation topic covered the modernization of like professional ballparks and stadiums with the NFL and Major League Baseball. I've had doc students come in and do topics on modernization of NBA and NHL arenas. I've also had doc students do things on innovation, diffusion of college football stadiums, and more recently, the financing of like college football. So I've always had a great interest in like the context of college football and certainly sport in general. And so as I start working on one project, I'm always aware that there might be other projects that I potentially could do moving forward. And so one of the really great things for me about doing a project like this is that, again, these papers that I have here on this particular list right here are things I initially planned on doing. These were things that emerged out of an archival visit I might have did at those places for another project. And it became such a honey hole. I was like, well, I just got to keep doing this stuff now because this is such an incredible, wealth of information here. And then it seems like I've gotten a lot of really good response from the different projects I've developed at these different historical societies and different, journals and stuff like that. So that's really how I got interested in it. Even my own background. I mean, I was a member of the Penn State men's basketball team when I was an undergrad. And so I've had a great fascination with sport venues and all the people that fill it. But I've always wanted to know, like, how did this thing grow as big as it did or as complex as it did? And what's the roots of it? Because I'm just naturally interested in that. So you combine all those things together and you get something like, I guess, what I have here today so far. But this is a work in progress, and I'm certainly looking forward to developing a really strong paper like I think I've done for a lot of these other journals and associations.
Awesome. Thank you, Chad. And with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we would like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Chad. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. So for more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. And while you are there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on August 10th. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.